To tonight's seminar. My name is Peter Raftopoulos, President of the Ithacan Historical Society, which is proud to support our online lectures on the history of Ithaca and the broader Ionian region. Tonight, our lecture is presented by Peter Prineas, who is a Sydney-based author of Catherian descent. Peter has published several works on often forgotten or neglected themes in the history of Greek migration to Australia. His work has not only traced the stories of his own ancestors who left Kythera and eventually established a successful theatre in rural New South Wales in the 1920s, but sought to situate individual and local experiences within the context of Greek and Australian political history. His most recent major work and the basis of tonight's lecture is entitled Wild Colonial Greeks. Here, Peter builds on his earlier work on the British protectorate of the Ionian Islands and works to extend our knowledge of the earliest Greek experiences of migration to the Australian colonies during the 19th century. How was the experience of these migrant Greek settlers affected by the fact that they came to Australia not from the young Kingdom of Greece, but from the British colonies in the Mediterranean? Did this affect the way they were received in their new colonial home? These are just a couple of the questions which Peter addresses in his book and which we look forward to him elaborating on tonight. Following tonight's seminar, there will be time to ask questions, which we will take from both YouTube and Zoom. We now warmly welcome Peter Prineas. Thanks very much, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. Do I now go on to share screen or?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you all for joining me for this lecture. I appreciate your interest. This is about wild colonial Greeks, the prominence of Ionian Islanders among Australia's early Greek settlers. As has been mentioned, I have written a couple of relevant books, Britain's Greek Islands in 2012 and Wild Colonial Greeks, which was published in 2020. The first one mentioned was a history of the British protectorate from the perspective of Kythera, which is the island my parents and family originate from. And Wild Colonial Greeks is an attempt to bring some life to the subject of colonial immigration to Australia. There have been histories of which have covered this era, but they haven't breathed much life into the characters, and I've tried to do that by finding out more about them and trying to understand their struggle in the new country. Now, the first slide is perhaps a bit of a surprise. It's Governor Arthur's proclamation to the Aborigines. In the late 1820s, Governor Arthur of Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania, was hoping to end a conflict between the settlers and the Aborigines, which had come to a climax at that time. And he had a large number of proclamation boards painted, illustrated, and had them nailed up to trees in Tasmania. They were meant to give the Aborigines an assurance of fair treatment under British rule. What the Aborigines made of them, nobody really knows. But some years later, there appeared a version which was printed on paper, hand-coloured. An example of which is shown here. And as you can see, it's an elementary narrative which tells you that if an Aborigine harms or spears or kills a white man, a settler, then he'll be punished. And vice versa, if a settler kills an Aborigine, he'll be punished in the same way. So it was a rather naive attempt, I think, to explain British justice. Now, the relevance of this is that on my first trip to Kythera, or Cirigo, or Cirigo, as it was known to the Venetians, in 1977, I visited the local museum, which was a very humble provincial institution. And I was very surprised to see there a copy of Governor Arthur's proclamation to the Aborigines, this amazing document. It made me realise that Kythera, the Ionian Islands, and colonial Australia were connected. The connection, of course, was that both were part of the British Empire during Australia's early colonial period, and there'd been traffic between Australia and Kythera, and somehow this document found its way into the little museum on the island. It's necessary for us in considering this subject to know a little bit more about the Ionian Islands, to understand what it was that resulted in quite a number of Greeks leaving the islands and coming to Australia. So we'll move on to a map. The Ionian Islands were a British protectorate, which were basically consisted of 7 large islands and their peripheral islands along the west coast of Greece and down to the south coast. They were former Venetian possessions. You had Corfu up here, which was the main island and the seat of the capital and the seat of government under the British. You had Little Paxo. Further south was Santa Maura, now known as Lefkada, almost attached to it, but just separated by a little strait, was Kalamos, which I'll mention earlier. And then we come to Ithaca, the home of Odysseus. And across the strait, we have Kefalonia. A little bit further to the south, we have Zante, as it was known to the Venetians and now known as Zakynthos. And then we leave the Ionian Islands really as a geographical group, and we continue south to Kythera and its little outlying island. It was known as I said earlier, Cirigo or Cirigo, and its little outlier, Cerigotto, now known as Antikythera. And these were all part of the British Protectorate. Each one was a state, it was a federation, and each had a representative to the central government in Corfu or Kerkera. Now, this is the coat of arms of the Ionian Islands under the British. It continued the traditional symbols of the various islands. For instance, with Kythera, we have Aphrodite sitting in her shell. Ithaca has the head of Odysseus. Kerkera has a boat. I believe it was a rudderless boat, but I'm not quite, I'd have to read up on my mythology to understand the significance of that. And in the centre, of course, we have the British lion and unicorn, indicating that it was subject to the British monarchy. It's interesting to notice that the flag down here incorporates not only the British Union Jack, but also the winged lion of Venice. The British were reluctant to disturb the culture the Venetians left behind them, because the Ionian nobility were very useful to them in governing the islands. Italian continued as an official language, along with English. Greek was nominally an official language from an early period in the history of the Protectorate, but it was slow to take up its proper place, even though it was always the language of the masses. The contadini, or the peasantry, didn't speak much Italian, they spoke only Greek. The signori, or the upper class or nobility in some cases, tended to be Italian speakers, although they also spoke Greek, because it was necessary to speak some Greek to be able to converse with your farm labourers and lower classes. I'll just now briefly talk about the constitutional arrangements because they are of interest. It would be hard to find a constitution as cynical as the one that was drafted by Sir Thomas Maitland, the first Lord High Commissioner of the Ionian Protectorate. When Solomos penned his epic poem Hymn to Liberty in 1823, the first two stanzas of which would later become the Greek national anthem, he referred to the Ionian Islands as artfully chained. For the first 35 years of the Protectorate, Ionians lacked the rights and freedoms enjoyed by the British. They were not British subjects. They had to apply for passports to travel abroad, which at that time no British subject was required to do. There was no free press. The Lord High Commissioner had a high police power, which he could use to deprive any Ionian citizen, even a member of Parliament, of his liberty without charge or trial. And towards the end of the period, the life of the Protectorate, that power was used against political dissidents. I have to balance these remarks by mentioning the good the British did. They established an education system better than any that previously existed in the islands. They brought stability, they built infrastructure, and they contributed to the island's prosperity. This resulted in a large increase in population by the 1850s, which was a factor pushing Ionians abroad in search of land and better opportunities, and why a considerable number of them ended up in Australia. One thing the British did not do well was to provide employment for Ionian youth. There was no Ionian army or navy, and the British forces were closed to them. This was another factor pushing young men to leave the islands for other places such as Australia. Now, this slide shows the Lord High Commissioner who followed Sir Frederick Adam. This man is, I beg your pardon, this is Sir Frederick Adam. The first Lord High Commissioner was Thomas Maitland. On the outbreak of the Greek Revolution in 1821, Britain's Foreign Minister, Castlereagh, who had worked hard to settle the balance of power in Europe after Waterloo, was not very impressed with the Greeks and their revolution, and he described them as agitated peasants. His successor, George Canning, was more accommodating. He allowed the Greeks to be recognised as legitimate belligerents at war with the Turks. However, this concession was made without any retreat from Castlereagh's policy of strict neutrality, and with the aim of protecting British trade and controlling Greek piracy. The Lord High Commissioner of the Ionian Islands, shown here, Sir Frederick Adam, is robed like a Roman statesman. This was the convention among sculptors of the day when depicting important men. He didn't really get around in a Roman robe. Adam saw piracy by the Greeks as a threat to Britain's trade. And much of that trade in 1821 or 22 or thereabouts involved selling war munitions to the Turks. He called for more warships to be sent to police the seas, and noticed that lacking a regular navy, the provisional Greek government relied on issuing letters of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E, letters of marque, to privately owned Greek vessels, known as privateers. And these letters of marque authorised them to stop and search any ship sailing in the war zone. If such a ship was found to be carrying war materials to the Turks, the privateer could seize it and its cargo as a prize, and this was all legal under the laws of war. However, Adam wanted to limit the Greeks' right to stop and search vessels, to regularly commission warships. And he knew, of course, that the Greek government had very few of these. I mean, there had not been a Greek government for more than a year or so. And of course, they didn't have a navy. They relied on privately owned vessels owned by Greeks. He eventually persuaded Whitehall on this point, and the Greeks' ability to intercept ships without retaliation by the British Navy was much reduced. So unless it was a Greek naval vessel owned by the government and regularly commissioned, the British wouldn't accept that it had the right to stop and search a ship. The effect of this policy reached as far as Australia, when 7 Greek convicts, most of them from Hydra, arrived in Sydney in 1829. They were convicted of piracy by a British naval court in Malta after boarding and plundering a British flagged vessel sailing to Alexandria, an enemy port. There were other aspects of their conduct that contributed to their undoing, but in sailing a privateer and not a regularly commissioned warship, they were vulnerable to the British policy against piracy. And so they were convicted. At first, most of them were sentenced to death by hanging, but their death sentences were commuted to liner transportation. And so they ended up in New South Wales, although not forever. Most of them went back after they received absolute pardons 7 or 8 years later. Now, the British Navy might have been closed to Ionians, but the British merchant marine was not. Ionian men took opportunities offered to them to go to sea on British ships, and it's not surprising that some of them reached Australia. We see here an 1832 record of the criminal court at Parramatta. And this line here you'll see says, George Manuel to be imprisoned in His Majesty's jail at Newcastle and there kept to hard labour for and during the term of 12 calendar months. This penalty was imposed on George for the crime of feloniously receiving, in company with another man, John Long, £50 weight of tobacco worth £5 sterling, which had earlier been stolen by an unknown person. So they were convicted of being receivers of stolen goods. From an entry in a jail entrance and description book, which I'm not able to show here, unfortunately, we learn some important facts about George Manuel or Emmanuel. He began his term of imprisonment at the Sydney jail on 20th November 1832. And from there he was taken to Newcastle jail, where he gave his native place as Corfu, his occupation as mariner, and his legal status on arriving in the colony and on entering jail as free. Furthermore, he gave his year of arrival in the colony as 1823, and the ship on which he arrives appears to have been the British brig Courier. And there is separate evidence, documentation of a George Manuel arriving on the Courier in 1823. Records of a George Manuel or Emmanuel living in the Parramatta and nearby Hills district continue for more than half a century after this, up to 1878, when the death of George Manuel, or Emmanuel, generally known as George the Greek, was reported in several newspapers. At the time, George was the owner of a 40-acre farm at Castle Hill. He was a fruit grower. As stated in my book, Wild Colonial Greeks, there is sufficient evidence to show that George Manuel, a native of Corfu and an Ionian, was Australia's first Greek. He preceded the 7 Greek convicts transported to Australia in 1829 by nearly 6 years. If we can move on. Here we have Catherine Crummer. Soon after the outbreak of the Greek Revolution in May 1821, refugees from the Aegean, from the Greek mainland, from Asia Minor, and the Aegean Islands streamed into the Ionian Islands. By the summer of 1822, Serigo, or Kythera, and its tiny neighbour, Serigotta, or Antikythera, was hosting about 2,000 refugees, an enormous number. The Ionian government tried to stop the refugees from coming, but later gave in to the inevitable and established a refugee camp. This was sited on the island of Kalamos, close to Santa Mora or Lefkada. Captain James Crummer, a Waterloo veteran, was in charge of about 9,000 Greek women and children at Kalamos, and one of them was Katerina Plessos, who in 1824 had made her way there from Missolonghi. And in 1827, at the age of 18, she married James Crummer. This is her, of course, at a late age in Australia. She married James Crummer, and in 1835, Crummer and Ekaterini, now known as Catherine, landed in Sydney, making her the first known Greek woman to come to Australia. She accompanied James Crummer in his government postings to Newcastle, Maitland and Port Macquarie, where he died in 1867. Catherine bore him 11 children, of whom 5 died. She lived another 40 years as a widow in Sydney and never returned to Greece. Regrettably, there are no letters or diaries to reveal her thoughts and feelings. And when this photograph was taken of her late in life, she had the distinction of being one of the last living persons to speak with Byron, whom she met in Missolonghi in 1824. Now I just move on to the next slide. Sorry, here we go. James Crummer was certainly not the only Ionian Islands official to find his way to Australia. The journey was made by persons of much higher rank. In 1859, Sir George Bowen, former Chief Secretary of the Ionian government, arrived to take up his post as the first governor of Queensland, which was then a new colony. He was accompanied by Lady Bowen and their child. Lady Bowen was Diamantina or Diamantina Roma, a daughter of the aristocracy in Zakynthos. She was an attractive and welcoming and gracious figure with a love of gardening and known for her generosity and her charitable activities. She was very popular among the colonists of Queensland, especially the women, and the town of Roma and Diamantina River are named after her. Unfortunately, we don't have very much to go on as to her impressions of Queensland or Australia. She wrote many letters home, and all of them were kept up till about the early 1950s, when there was a devastating earthquake in Zakynthos and a series of events which led to the loss of all those letters, which apparently were full of description. A great loss indeed. Bowen and Diamantina would also occupy Government House in Victoria in later years. This portrait here is of Sir John Young, who was Lord High Commissioner of the Ionian Islands before being sent to govern New South Wales. Young distinguished himself by formulating the view that Britain should rid itself of the southern Ionian Islands by giving them to Greece and retain Corfu and Paxel as crown colonies. A report expressing these views was leaked to the London press and created a furore, resulting in Young being recalled to London. Bowen was Young's chief secretary in Corfu and must have helped him formulate his views on the future of the islands. And it is interesting that in the 7 years when they governed neighbouring colonies in Australia, they never met or exchanged personal correspondence. We'll now get on to some ordinary Ionians under various categories. Deserters are an important category. In 1849, the Navigation Acts were repealed. This changed the ethnic composition of crews on British ships. Early in the 19th century, only about 20% of a crew might be non-British. By late in the century, the proportion had doubled to 40%. And Greeks were among the increasing numbers of foreigners crewing British ships, and more of them were reaching Australian ports. In 1851, there were remarkable gold discoveries in Victoria and New South Wales. 50,000 immigrants a year were soon arriving in the colonies, more than 4 times the rate of the previous decade. The great majority of them landed even without the need for a passport. You could just give your name to the captain, who handed in a list to the port authorities. And if your country wasn't at war with the enemy, if your country wasn't at war with Australia or the colony, and if you didn't have an infectious disease, then you went ashore. You didn't even have to identify yourself with a document. You just said who you were, and that had to be accepted. A ship on reaching an Australian port in the early 1850s was likely to lose many of its crew to the goldfields. At Melbourne on the 6th of January 1852, there were 35 ships in port, unable to sail as more than half of their crews had deserted. A breach of a seaman's service was more than a private dispute. The seaman could be convicted of desertion and sentenced to a term in jail. Andreas Lakatsas, a native of Ithaca, is believed to have jumped ship in 1851. He was one of the early arrivals on the Ballarat goldfield. Alexander Zakharov was brought before the Water Police Court in Sydney in 1853. Newspaper reported him to be a Greek belonging to the crew of the FC Clark. We can assume he might have been an Ionian, as it was reported that he made his defence in Italian. Zakharov was sentenced to 4 weeks in jail. Another deserting Ionian sailor was John Panham of Corfu, who was apprehended by the Water Police at Newcastle in 1855. He was charged with desertion from the Rob Roy, a vessel then in Sydney Harbour. Panham pleaded guilty and he was ordered to be sent back on board. John Duffy, also from Corfu, deserted from the ship Spray of the Ocean in 1855. A reward of £5 was offered for his capture. To avoid arrest, deserting Greek sailors often anglicised their names or adopted new English names. This makes it difficult to determine who were Greeks and from where in Greece they came. The famed, and now we'll move on to gold seekers. The famed, who were really another category of deserters, because many deserters went on to be gold seekers. That was the reason they deserted. The famed Corfu Reef was discovered in May 1859 by a Greek. He must have been a Corfuite, as he went by the name Spiro Corfu. What could be more Corfuite than that? He and a Greek partner were digging on their claim near Sandy Creek in Victoria, Tarnagalla today, when they uncovered a rich gold seam. Several more Greeks joined them. They later made another big find nearby, which they named the Hellas Reef. And they were so jubilant, they raised a Greek flag, which they happened to have over the diggings. It's probably the first time a Greek flag was seen fluttering under an Australian sky. Soon they unearthed what was a local newspaper claimed to be the largest cake of amalgamated gold ever yet produced. It weighed 1,040 ounces. It was so valuable the Greeks stood guard over it all night, armed to the teeth, according to one newspaper. They then escorted it into the Union Bank, which paid them more than £4,000 sterling for it, over $500,000 in today's money. But just 2 years later, in December 1861, the fortunes of these Greeks had declined so much that their gold mine had to be put up for auction. It was reported that they were selling it not because it was unprofitable, but because of their disagreements. One newspaper observer wrote, "Greek sailors have a certain well-known character in every port they visit. Mutual distrust arose, insubordination followed, carelessness supervened, and finally the auctioneer stepped in." Another group who were noticed were the knife fighters. Some habits of the Greeks did not fit well with the dominant culture. In 1859, a Greek seaman named Thomas Nizer was brought before a court in Sydney for stabbing a fellow countryman named Nicholas Stamboul. Asked to explain his use of the knife, Nizer said, "'Tis the fashion of the country." Historian Thomas Gallant describes Greece in the 19th century as an honour culture, where knife fighting was as ritualised and rule-bound as the aristocratic duel. He suggests these clashes should be considered a form of lower-class duelling. Gallant says of the Greeks of the Ionian Islands, "A man had to rise to the challenge or lose status. Once the knives were drawn, the men followed a known script. They aimed not to kill, but to maim, not to slay, but to scar. They sought to cut the face of their opponents." Thomas Gallant's premise is well illustrated in an incident at remote Kiandra in the Snowy Mountains of New South Wales, where thousands of gold miners were gathered in 1859. The local newspaper there reported that a man had been seriously stabbed in a melee in one of the public houses. The newspaper said the man was a Greek who had been seriously wounded by a person unknown, and the wound extended from the top of the nose to the chin. Another report confirmed that a Greek was cut very severely in the face. Both his upper and under lips were completely cut through. It was also reported that the wounds were sewn up by a doctor and no serious result was anticipated. Press reports of knife fights amongst Greeks and other Southern Europeans appeared from time to time and evoked general disapproval. Other early Ionians, a quick roundup: Samuel Dons, perhaps Andonis of Kefalonia, was a sailor who arrived as early as 1837 and went on to become a gold miner in Victoria. Another one was Spiro Contiotis of Zante or Zakynthos. He changed his surname to Williams. He arrived in Melbourne in the 1840s as a mere boy, perhaps 14 or 15 years old. He later became a bitter enemy of his countryman, the Melbourne hotelier Andrew Lagoyanis of Patra. The two men at one point had a fight in the street, trading blows with a spade. George Paxinos, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, of Ithaca, arrived in 1853 and set up a shop in Ballarat. He was possibly the first Greek shopkeeper in Victoria. Catherians were among early Ionians who came to Australia, apparently, although documentary evidence is lacking. Claims are made for the arrival in the 1850s of Yannis Militas and Halalambos Menegas, also an Manuel Critharis. A later wave of arrivals in Melbourne included Marinos Lakatsas and his brother Antonios Lakatsas, later known as Anthony Lucas. Also George Morphesis, all from Ithaca. They came in the late 1880s and prospered in real estate cafes and food establishments. The Catherians preferred Sydney, where Athanasios Kominos arrived in 1873, followed by his brother Yanni in the following decade. Together they built up a large oyster growing and marketing business, each in turn revelling in the title Oyster King. I'll now move on to some other people of interest. The first being Spiro Contiotis, a doctor. Now this slide shows the hospital at Claremont in central Queensland in 1876, when Contiotis was the medical officer there. There is no known photograph of Contiotis, at least that I've been able to find, but it is possible that he's one of the men shown standing on the front steps. Near the end of 1854, an advertisement appeared in Melbourne's Argus newspaper introducing Australia's first Greek medical practitioner. This was Spiro Contiotis, then aged 30, who gave MD of Corfu as his medical qualification. He had practiced for a time in Paris, apparently, then sailed for Melbourne late in 1852. During the voyage, he became acquainted with a fellow passenger, an English widow named Emma Booker, the mother of a boy named Joseph. They later married in Melbourne. Contiotis' first surgery at Emerald Hill was probably a tent. It was a suitable preparation for life on the Victorian goldfields, where he practiced medicine for the next 6 years, moving with each rush to a new field. As well as being a competent doctor, Contiotis had the instincts of a showman and used the press to promote his medical practice. This made him a conspicuous figure, and it sometimes operated to his detriment, as when a feud with a provincial newspaperman nearly led to a duel. His work on the Victorian goldfields brought him into contact with some interesting people, among them Robert O'Hara Burke of Burke and Wills fame, Inspector Hare, who later led the police in the attack on the Kelly gang at Glenrowan, and Justice Redmond Barry, who judged the Eureka Stockade rebels, and later Ned Kelly. Contiotis and Emma had 2 daughters in Victoria, but his medical skill could not prevent one of them from dying in infancy. From Victoria, Contiotis and family travelled to New South Wales, where they spent some months on the goldfield at Forbes and later lived in Sydney. During his time in Victoria, Dr. Contiotis tried to get an appointment as a coroner. And this note was on a file attached to his application or correspondence. It states, Dr. Contiotis. Dr. Contiotis applies to be appointed coroner at Inglewood. I think he had better wait until he learns to speak English without a foreign accent, and until he has learned that there is no H in should, there is an H in should, and that there is no U in remove. Signed, JDW, a public servant, 1st of November 1860. Possibly one of the reasons he left Victoria. It wasn't all downhill for him. He became quite a famous figure locally in Queensland, and in 1880 he was appointed a Justice of the Peace, the first Greek Australian to be appointed to such an office. And here's his signature, one oath to the monarch and one oath to the people. In 1863, Contiotis moved his family to the river port of Rockhampton in the new colony of Queensland. He had some trouble there, partly of his own doing, I think. Fell out with the local medical community, to put it mildly. He opted once more for life on a goldfield, this time at Claremont in central Queensland. He would spend the rest of his life there with Emma. In Claremont, much enmity was directed at him by Charles Buzzacott, the editor of the local newspaper, who did his best to blacken Contiotis' name. Contiotis defied Charles Buzzacott's efforts to drive him out of Claremont, but the mud thrown at him has stuck. I have noticed this. In my reading about Contiotis, he's always presented as a figure of a turbulent figure, a man who was always caught at the centre of strife. And a recent exhibition by the Claremont Historical Centre states, the story of the first doctor at Peaks Downs Hospital, Dr. Spiridon Contiotis, is one of intrigue, with the doctor's time in Claremont described as turbulent and unpredictable. So intrigue, turbulent and unpredictable. After looking at his life in some detail, I don't know how this can be said of a doctor who served Claremont well for 25 years and was repeatedly elected by the community to serve as their hospital medical officer. It's a long story and I can't go into it all here, but I feel that he was wrongly maligned. We'll now go on to Evgenios Gennatas, another man who I think has been maligned unjustly. This is a photograph of contested date. I was told by the library in Queensland, Brisbane, that it was 1864. But when I tracked down the original photograph, I found that that was based on a handwritten dedication on the back, which gave the date 1864. 1864, I think, is the date of the dedication, the written dedication, not the date of the photograph. Gilchrist, in his book Australians and Greeks, reproduces this photograph and assumes or suggests that this man is Evgenios Gennatas. Certainly looks the part. He looks like a Greek. Unfortunately, he's wearing what look like sergeant's chevrons, which is not indicative of Gennatas because he was never a sergeant. He was either a cadet or a second lieutenant. So there's some doubt about it. I mean, it might have been a borrowed jacket. Who knows? He had to ride 5 days to get to Rockhampton, where this photo was taken. The other thing is that many of these, or a majority of these men who are named in one version of the photograph, somebody has named them, and those names don't correspond with, in 4 cases, with native troopers who were serving at the same time as Gennatas, which would make 1864 an unlikely date. And a further bit of evidence, which I've thrown in, is that there was a visiting photographer in Rockhampton in 1861 or thereabouts, when this gentleman was in charge. And he was offering photographic sittings, and it could well be one of his photographs. Anyway, enough of that. In August 1860, a young man of 28 years of age named Evgenios Gennatas, a native of Corfu, arrived at Brisbane, the capital of the new Crown Colony of Queensland. The first governor, Sir George Bowen, had appeared there only 10 months before with Diamantina Roma, his wife. Gennatas wasted no time in calling on the governor, who knew him as the son of a noble family at Corfu. Well, whether it was a noble family, they're a noble family or not, I don't know, but it's probably just a general description of him being a man, an educated Ionian of good family. About a month after his arrival, a new system of cadetships was introduced in the native mounted police. Not only had the new cadet system been established, but a suitable appointee had been found in Gennatas. To Bowen and Gennatas, this transaction would not have seemed unusual, as both were familiar with the ways of the Ionian Islands, where Britishers ran the government and educated young Ionians of good family were always petitioning officials for a remunerated position of one sort or another. Gennatas' first posting was to Rockhampton, where he was caught up in the drama of Fanny Briggs, a young woman of the town who had apparently been murdered by Aborigines, some of whom were said to be troopers in the native mounted police. Promoted quickly to second lieutenant, Gennatas was posted to a remote camp on the Peak Downs, where he patrolled a vast area with his native troopers to ensure there was peace between the settlers and the Aborigines. Peace was achieved by dispersing troublesome groups of Aborigines. Now, dispersing sounds fairly innocuous, but it was a euphemism for them riding up and firing into said groups of Aborigines with double-barreled carbines and killing as many as they could. There seems to be, if he was in charge of such a group, there must have been some killing of Aborigines under his orders. His adventures in Queensland included a dash across 70 miles of central Queensland to Cullen Laringo Station, when 19 people there, settlers, white settlers, were massacred by Aborigines. So you see, it was a situation of warfare, really. And the native mounted police were a quasi-military operation. Jonathan Richards, in his book, The Secret War, A True History of Queensland's Native Police, published by the University of Queensland Press in 2008, mentions Gennatas. Under the subheading, A Taste for Blood, Gennatas is included in a list of 15 officers described as the most brutal group of the officer class and most likely to be dismissed for disciplinary or character reasons. The same book presents a list of 29 men described as the most violent officers, men recorded as being dismissed or allowed to resign or chastised after being involved in unlawful killings. Gennatas' name also appears in this list. Does Evgenios Gennatas deserve to be so remembered? He cannot be seen as a virtuous figure, as he served, albeit briefly and perhaps naively, in a paramilitary force whose function it was to violently suppress Aboriginal resistance. However, no specific act is presented in the Secret War that would justify placing Gennatas in the most brutal group of the officer class or among the most violent officers. There's just no evidence presented at all. The charge that Gennatas was among officers recorded as being dismissed or allowed to resign or chastised after being involved in unlawful killings is untrue. So far as is known, he was not dismissed or required to resign for those reasons at all. So far as is known, the closest he came to an unlawful killing was as a cadet, when his senior officer, Lieutenant Powell, shot and killed a prisoner named Gulliver, an Aboriginal trooper alleged to have been involved in the murder of Fanny Briggs. Powell's claim that he was compelled to fire on Gulliver as he was escaping is open to doubt. And one wonders why Powell is not listed among the most brutal 15 or the most violent 29, while Gennatas is in both lists. The records such as they exist, and they're not complete records by any means, the records suggest that the immediate cause of Gennatas' resignation was the desertion of a group of new native troopers under his command and his failure to return them to duty. Rather than displaying a taste for blood, Gennatas' brief career suggests something else. Before his resignation, he had submitted a written report to his commandant alleging crimes against Aborigines by a Peak Downs squatter named Chambers. These involved the kidnapping of women, Aboriginal women, and the shooting and stabbing of Aboriginal men. Gennatas' report on Chambers showed a moral sense that did not sit well with his role as an officer in the Queensland Native Mounted Police and was embarrassing to his superiors. There's a great deal more to be said in that story, but I haven't got the time to give you any more, so we'll have to go on. We're getting close to the end of my lecture, so we'll finish with a couple of observations. By the late 1890s, Greek communities had formed in Australia's major cities. Shown here is the first Greek Orthodox church, Hagia Triada in Sydney, as it was shown in the press soon after its consecration in 1899. Immigrants from Kithra, notably John Comino, were prominent in establishing this church, just as immigrants from Ithaca, notably Anthony Lucas, led in the establishment of the Evangelismos Church in Melbourne a year or so later. And now we come to the last slide. This view of Melbourne's Town Hall Cafe in Swanston Street in the early 1900s shows a very substantial building built by Anthony Lucas, or Lakatzis, a leader of Melbourne's Ithacan community. And it suggests how much what social and economic heights had been reached by some Greeks from the Ionian Islands in the new country. This would have been about 1903. Anyway, that concludes my lecture, and thank you very much for listening to me. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them, or try to anyway. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Peter. We'd really like to thank Peter Prineas for his excellent presentation tonight, and I'm sure many of us would look forward to purchasing a copy of Wild Colonial Greeks to further read about those early Greek migrants. Your work has been invaluable in helping us understand their experiences, ensuring that this unique chapter of our history is recorded and not forgotten. So now I'd like to open the session to any questions that we'd like to ask of Peter Prineas. Thanks very much. Who would like to kick the questions off?
Peter, if I could ask a question. Andrew Raftopoulos here.
Yes, Andrew.
I'm kind of, I bought your British Greek Islands book a few years ago in preparation for our Ithacan Society centenary. And at the time I did produced a biographical sort of retrospective on H.J. Lucas, who you mentioned before. There's interesting parallels between the Melbourne Greek community and the Sydney one, and certainly, as you mentioned, the Catherians seem to occupy a similar position in the Greek community in both states and both cities. Over the years, I have made some friends who happen to be Catherians in Sydney, and I'm interested because we've taken certain steps with our society to make it learn more about our history, both in Australia but also through this initiative that Peter and Kyriako have started by inviting guests such as yourself to speak to us, just to learn a bit more about our background, not only in Australia but also of the Ionian history. At the time I got your book, which is about 6 years ago, I was aware that the Catherian Association in Sydney has, taken similar steps, and certainly, I think, in advance of our society. And my question is more about the Catherians in Sydney and the association, and how people such as yourself, second and third generation Australians have organised themselves in a way that they can sort of record history. They can, set an agenda for future investigation and so forth, because that could be of great use to our group. Because I can see that over the years we've had sort of some great success in documenting your history. And can you maybe say a few words about how the Catherian community of Sydney has gone about this task?
Well, they put a lot of effort into, I've forgotten the term for it, the searching family history. They had a couple of members pursuing that very vigorously, and unfortunately, there was a bit of a falling out, because there was some question about proprietary rights and whatever. So it has stumbled a bit lately, but I don't want to dwell on that. A great deal of good work has happened, and very happy to see that. The Catherian Association and the Nicholas Rooney Trust were very kind to finance my book, Britain's Greek Islands, that enabled me to go to London and spend 2 lots of 3 weeks each in the public archives at Kew, going through the records of the protectorate, which were taken there, you know, the British records.
Mm.
And I wrote that book from those handwritten copperplate records, and a great deal of it hadn't been used, so that was worthwhile effort. Well, of course I would say that, but I mean, I think generally it's been seen as a good exercise. And but my later book, Wild Colonial Greeks, was entirely my own effort, and I found a commercial publisher. So it was a different approach. But there's a great deal of scope for societies like the Ithacan Association and the Ithacan, well, I'm not sure what you call your group, association.
The Ithacan Philanthropic Society.
Yeah, I mean, there is a great deal of scope for research into records. I mean, that's where it needs to be done, the nitty-gritty, you know, finding, going into state records and finding the names and tracking them all. Surprising how much you can find. I mean, my book, Wild Colonial Greeks, you would have thought that everybody would have exhausted Trove, but they hadn't. You know, Trove is the digital newspaper archive run by the National Library. I found huge amounts of material there that had never been used, never been brought before a contemporary audience. And so, you know, there's probably still more. So there's a lot of work that can still be done to piece together the history of Greeks.
So are you part of the Ithacan Society, or
No, I'm a member. I'm a
management?
member. I have been active in various ways. You know, I've written for the magazine, and they helped me and I helped them with the Bingra exercise in setting up a museum, a Greek museum, around the history of Greek cafes and cinemas in Bingra. Admittedly, that had something to do with my family connection, because my grandfather was involved in the cafe and cinema at Bingra. And I wrote a book about that called Katsahamos and the Great Idea.
Yes, I noticed that's mentioned in just inside the cover of Britain's Greek Islands.
Yeah.
Maybe, Peter, you could, just as a segue to Andrew's questions, there's another one in connection about your own family history, and if you could just elaborate about your connections to Githera and how your research unfolded. With that type of, the British Ionian Islanders.
Well, sorry. What should I do there?
Oh, you're all good. You keep going.
Okay. Well, my own family have been here now, if you count from my father's advent to Australia, we're here 100 years. This year, 2022. He came in 1922. My maternal grandfather came the year before, and his brother came in 1914. So we've been here a long time, but we haven't forgotten who we are. And we still have links to the island. I was born in Australia. I didn't see Githera until I was 29. And that's why I was so surprised to see this thing in the museum. Can you see what I'm pointing at here?
No, we can't.
No, I'm sorry. Okay, I was referring to the Governor Arthur's proclamation of the Aborigines. I was so surprised to see it. But we still, some of my siblings still have the house the original house on the island. And we have a history with the island, but not always happy. My father came to Australia and went back and married my mother, and then the war broke out, and they had to go through 6 years of the occupation. It wasn't 6 years; it was more like 4 years of the occupation. And then they were hit by the Civil War, which came early to Kithra, and and encouraged them to leave again and come to, in the case of my father again, and come to Australia in 46, 47. And it's not entirely a happy history. I mean, there's a lot of heartache involved in being an immigrant, especially under those circumstances. And I think every Greek feels that at times.
Definitely the case of the divided heart.
Yeah, that's right. And also, one is culturally in a minority in Australia, and you have to deal with that. But I mean, it's been a good country for the Greeks. And I wanted to end my slide on a high point. They built a community. They built communities. They brought their religion with them, and they prospered. In the main, that was the usual story. Or was the often, well, perhaps not usual, but a prominent story.
Just a question on the theatres that your families, or theatre that your family, could you elaborate a little bit on that, Peter?
Yeah, look, Katsahamos I wrote when I discovered that the Roxy Theatre at Bingra, a town in northwest New South Wales, had been restored and reopened as a local government project. And I heard about it after it had been opened. They did mention the builders, but nobody who was none of their descendants knew about the big opening and all the money, the state government money that had been given to make it possible, and the story of the Greeks had been completely overlooked. And I was incensed, really, and it motivated me to write Katsahamos and the Great Idea, which is the story of that picture theatre and our family. And it did change things, because the people at Bingra read the book and realised that the people and the history were as important as the bricks, as the building itself, and embraced the story. And I had they arranged for a launching of the book in Bingra, and there was a big dinner and dance in the Roxy Theatre. And there were several events after that. One for the opening of the cafe, which had been a Chinese restaurant for some years, and that was restored at a cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars using a state grant, I believe it was, and turned back to something that looked very much like the original cafe. And then it was decided that there should be a museum in the premises, and I had the honour of being the curator, and that was a very exciting and interesting period. And I worked with some excellent people from Melbourne who do museums, and we set up a nice museum, and we got a prize for it as being the best in its class. So that was quite a good story in the end. And I'm hoping that we'll go up to Bingra again, and perhaps on another anniversary of the theatre, Sydney, when it comes up.
And is that a permanent display, Peter?
The museum?
Yes.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's there all the time. It's a very professional and permanent display. It has exhibits and also videos that run on request or intermittently, and the whole, as well as it can be told in such a small area. We're not talking about a vast space.
Sure.
The story of the cafes and the morphing into cinema, which is what happened when you had successful Greek cafe owners. They knew where the crowds were coming from, and they realised that they owned the cinema as well. They'd have both ends covered. So if they made any money in a cafe, they soon looked at buying the cinema, and they did. And that happened in many towns, and Bingra was just one of them. And so many, there were many examples of Greeks owning cinemas. I think there was a PhD thesis about it by a man named Kevin Cork, and I was able to get a lot of information about Bingra from that. He's deceased, unfortunately. I was able to get a lot of information about the Bingra cinemas from there, as well as doing a lot of my own research elsewhere.
Seems we share a common type of culinary cafe type of cinematography history down here in Melbourne. Likewise, we had that similar type of history, which we're similarly trying to exhibit ourselves. So and document, of course. So and of course we experienced the same thing where AJ Lucas built the Capitol Theatre, and all the accolades went to the architect being Walter Griffin. So people forget AJ Lucas is actually subsidising it. So,
well, that's the story, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was his entrepreneurial skill that got together the joint venture that produced the that development. And it was on the side of the Town Hall Cafe, which you mentioned earlier, Peter. And
Yes.
He joined forces with property owner in that part of town, an Englishman, the Howie family, and with a couple of Americans who were brothers who set up Luna Park in Melbourne and some other entertainment venues.
Yeah.
They were originally from the States, and they had the connections with the Hollywood filmmakers. So put all three together, put some land together, some theatrical and cinema expertise, and business acumen, and produced a very successful development in Melbourne. Can I ask you one thing? I noticed there was an article in Nels Cosmos about a couple of weeks ago about an initiative happening on Kihira. An immigration museum was being set up. Do you know much about it?
Yeah, I read about it, but I have no connection with it.
No.
That's a local thing. And, well, they must have to deal with the diaspora. Is it about immigration? It would be more immigration than immigration, because there's not a lot of immigration to get through. So, yes, they'll have to be dealing with the diaspora. They'll be, no doubt, calling on the KAA and others to step up and help finance it. Yeah. I don't know much more about it.
No.
A couple of other questions are coming through. One from Ron Guy about you mentioning the increase of Greeks working on the British boats. did Greeks manage to work their way up into higher positions in the ship's hierarchy?
I think they did. I haven't got any definite proof of it, but I read somewhere that there was a captain on a British ship who was Greek, and but I can't give you chapter and verse on that, I'm afraid. I'd have to, and in fact, I think there was very little in the reference to hang your hat on, but it sounded credible. Yes, they did. They weren't just ordinary crewmen. They did work their way up and became senior people in the hierarchy. Yeah, and probably. He was probably not the only captain. You know, they were probably, Greeks are pretty good at sea, and it wouldn't surprise me if there were quite a few more of them. But we don't know, do we? Because nobody's made the effort to find out.
There's some more research. Another question I've got is, have you come across anything regarding the Melbourne Greeks who migrated to New Zealand?
No, I haven't, I'm afraid. I didn't include New Zealand in my recent work. There needs to be a book on that, on New Zealand Greek immigration. But you have to be in New Zealand to write it, I think. Have you got any Ithacans over there?
we do actually.
Right, well.
Yeah, and they have documented some. I think they're in the process of publishing a book or two.
Well, I've no doubt that the Greeks did go there, especially in colonial times. There was a gold rush in New Zealand, on the east coast.
Right.
Or was it the west coast? The west coast. And so they attracted, adventure seekers and gold diggers. And I'm sure Greeks would have been amongst them. Yeah.
What about the contrast with the Greeks that came from the Ionians in contrast to, was there any other Greeks from non-Ionian Greece on the mainland that came during that period?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yes, quite a few. I mean, it wasn't an Ionian only. It wasn't just the Ionians who came. The Ionians had an advantage in being exposed to the British in coming to Australia, but Greeks were immigrating probably to California for the gold fields there, and certainly to Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales for the gold opportunities there. And there's plenty of evidence of that.
And how did they integrate? How did they? The Ionian Greeks must have had a little bit of an idea about the British systems in contrast to mainland Greece. Did they have a better chance of integrating, or?
Yeah, if you grew up in Corfu or somewhere like that and was educated and had some exposure to English, you firstly you had the language to an extent, and you were exposed to the Brits to some degree. I mean, they weren't there in large numbers, but they were running the government, and if you had anything to do with the government, you had to deal with them. So yes, you had that advantage, and also their ships were calling it, British ships were calling it Ionian ports, much more commonly than they were Greek ports. And you could get a job. You could get, you could sail off on one and become a sailor. And so those opportunities were much more common to Ionians than they were, to somebody in Athens or in a Greek in Asia Minor. I mean, I'm not saying they didn't have such opportunities. I'm just saying that the Ionians were in the box seat, and they could get they had a better chance. making contact. When they got to Australia, I don't know whether they would have had enough education to know much about the system of government, but you know, they would have known something of the way the British ran a society. Although, as I said earlier, the Ionian Islands were not very much like Britain in their legal arrangements. They were far inferior in terms of civil society. But it was still a place where you could get ahead, you could prosper. It was stable because there was no war, there was no enemy taking over. And the education system was better than anything they had up to that point. Girls and boys were being educated to an extent that hadn't existed before. And they were getting, you know, enough reading, writing and arithmetic to get them ahead. Yes, they were.
Just one last question maybe from Chris Kay. Can you tell us more about the Ithacans working at the Golden Mile in WA? Have you got anything?
Oh, yeah, I've heard about them, but I didn't. That was, yeah. No, look, I'm not able to say much about them. They're not covered in my book. WA as a gold field came to the fore much later, very late. I think it was in the 1890s, and it was really well into the 20th century. So I didn't really get a chance to look at it to the same extent. Most of my work was Queensland and New South Wales and Victoria.
Mm.
So I'm sorry I can't throw a bit more light on that.
Yeah, well,
There is possibly a good book to be written about the Greeks in the first half of the 20th century before the war, before World War II. Quite a bit of material will be available, and there's certainly a lot of interest. You know, the whole World War I period and the Vicasmos, the schism between the king and Venizelos, and the war in Asia Minor in 1922 and thereabouts. All those things would certainly make an interesting history. Also, there was a lot of anti-migrant feeling on the Western Australian goldfields, which came to the fore both during World War I and again in the 1930s, and very serious attack on people who were culturally different. Not only Greeks but Yugoslavs were the victims of that activity. I think some work has been done in those areas, but there's probably more that can be done.
Well, thanks very much, Peter. Really appreciate tonight's presentation. It was a wonderful explanation, and we look forward to getting a couple of copies for the club of both of your books, and myself reading it as well. So really appreciate you coming online, and I'm sure everyone who's on Zoom and also on YouTube, and those who will catch up on YouTube in the coming days. So thanks very much again, Peter. And
well, thanks for giving me the opportunity. I hope it wasn't too tedious for you. I hope you enjoyed it, and I certainly enjoyed giving the lecture to you. So thank you. Thanks
very much. I think you're getting clapped by people around. It's been most appreciated, and we'll like to keep in touch. And,
all right.
And have a further discussion down the line about a similarly interesting topic.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Bye.
Thanks very much.